At precisely 8:45 on a Tuesday morning, when the village was still deciding whether it intended to be awake, Inspector Purbright received a visit that could not, by any reasonable social measure, have been postponed. Mr. Lionel Harcourt arrived without ringing the bell. This was, in itself, an act of some confidence. He opened the inspector's front gate, crossed the gravel path with a deliberate care that suggested respect rather than stealth, and tapped twice on the door with the knuckle of his index finger. The sound was neither timid nor forceful. It was the knock of a man who believed he would be received. Purbright, who had been buttering toast with an attention usually reserved for difficult interviews, paused. He waited an extra second before answering, not from irritation but from habit. Urgency, he had learned, often benefited from being kept briefly at bay. Mr. Harcourt stood very straight when the door opened. He wore a gray overcoat despite the mildness of the morning, his hat held in both hands as though it had recently offended him and been forgiven. His smile was courteous, arranged, and faintly strained at the edges. "I hope I'm not intruding," Mr. Harcourt said, immediately intruding. "Not at all," Purbright replied, which was not strictly true but sufficiently polite to function as truth in the circumstances. "You're early." "Yes," said Mr. Harcourt, relieved to agree with something. "I thought it best." Purbright stepped aside. He did not ask why. People who thought it best to arrive unannounced before 9 rarely benefited from being asked to justify the decision. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of toast and furniture polish. Mr. Harcourt removed his hat and glanced at his reflection in the mirror with a quick, dissatisfied look, as though expecting to find something missing. They sat in the small front room. Purbright poured tea without offering sugar. Mr. Harcourt accepted the cup with both hands and did not drink. "I'm not sure where to begin," Mr. Harcourt said. Purbright waited. "It's a very odd thing," Mr. Harcourt continued, lowering his voice as though the room itself might object. "I wouldn't have troubled you if it weren't." Purbright inclined his head. His manner, this morning, was mildly distant. Not cold, exactly. More as one might regard an overfamiliar acquaintance encountered unexpectedly in a shop. "What seems to be the difficulty?" he asked. Mr. Harcourt hesitated. His eyes moved, not nervously, but with calculation, as if arranging furniture in a room that resisted improvement. "I appear," he said carefully, "to have lost something." Purbright did not respond immediately. He had learned that silence often encouraged accuracy. "It isn't valuable," Mr. Harcourt added quickly. "At least, not in the usual sense. But it has been noticed." "By whom?" Mr. Harcourt allowed a brief, humorless smile. "By everyone." Purbright raised his eyes then. "That is quite an achievement." "Yes," said Mr. Harcourt. "It has rather spread." He finally drank his tea, grimacing slightly, as though the warmth had arrived at the wrong moment. "I suppose the simplest way to say it," he went on, "is that something about me is absent. People have remarked upon it. Politely, of course. Too politely." Purbright folded his hands. "And this absence began when?" "Yesterday evening. Or perhaps earlier. I can't be certain. You didn't notice it yourself?" Mr. Harcourt hesitated again. This time, the pause carried weight. "I noticed," he said. "I simply assumed I was mistaken." Purbright nodded. Assumptions, he had found, did much of the village's work. And this morning, Mr. Harcourt said, it was no longer possible to ignore. "What happened this morning?" "I was greeted," said Mr. Harcourt, with quiet emphasis. "Twice. By the same person. In 2 different ways." Purbright considered this. That would be unsettling. It was, Mr. Harcourt agreed. Particularly as the second greeting suggested I had already passed. Purbright leaned back slightly. His expression remained attentive, though something in his eyes had sharpened. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, "may I ask what you believe you have lost?" Mr. Harcourt looked directly at him then, and for the first time his composure faltered. "My shadow," he said. The word settled in the room. It did not echo. It did not demand reaction. It simply existed. Purbright did not smile. "People," Mr. Harcourt continued quickly, "have been very kind about it. They say it must be the light, or my position, or the angle of the sun. Several have offered to fetch lamps. And none have succeeded," Purbright said. "No." Outside, a delivery cart passed. The sound of wheels on stone was ordinary, reassuring, and entirely irrelevant. "When did anyone first mention it?" Purbright asked. "At the reading room," said Mr. Harcourt. Mrs. Bellows, quite accidentally. She stopped mid-sentence, then apologized, then asked whether I'd been unwell. And had you? No, Purbright considered this. Mr. Harcourt, he said at last, has anyone behaved towards you as though you were not quite where you appeared to be? Mr. Harcourt swallowed. Yes. Who? Mr. Harcourt named no one. Instead, he said, that is why I came early. Purbright accepted this. Early visits, like early conclusions, were often motivated by fear of being seen too late. He stood and collected the empty cups. I suggest, he said mildly, that you take a walk this morning. Go where you are usually expected. Observe how people behave. Say nothing. Mr. Harcourt looked uncertain. And you? I will also observe, Purbright said, from a distance. Mr. Harcourt rose. He hesitated at the door. Inspector, he said, do you think a thing like this can be taken? Purbright considered the question carefully. I think, he said, that things which are noticed late are rarely lost all at once. Mr. Harcourt nodded, though it was unclear whether he understood. When he had gone, Purbright returned to the front room. Sunlight lay across the carpet in a clean, untroubled shape. He looked at it for some time. Then he finished his toast. By 10:30, the village had adjusted itself to the morning, which meant that people had settled into their opinions about it. Tea had been poured in 3 separate parlors, each with a slightly different account of the weather, and at least one kettle was left to boil far longer than necessary because its owner was distracted by the business of remembering something that had not yet taken shape. Mr. Harcourt began his walk exactly as advised. He went first to the bakery, because he always did, and because the baker's wife believed routine to be the clearest proof of character. She greeted him without hesitation, then faltered, then smiled again in a manner that suggested she had corrected herself too late. Good morning, Mr. Harcourt, she said twice, with a pause between the words that did not belong to either greeting. He inclined his head. She handed him his loaf without comment, though her eyes followed the space beside him rather than his face. When he turned, she watched the floor with interest. Outside, the street appeared unchanged. Light fell as it always had, striking doorsteps, the low wall by the postbox, the edge of the green where the grass grew unevenly. Mr. Harcourt stopped deliberately and waited. Nothing joined him. 2 women passed, deep in discussion about an upcoming committee meeting. Their conversation continued uninterrupted until they reached him, at which point it thinned, stretched, and lost its shape. Sorry, one of them said, uncertain why. I thought, yes, said the other more firmly. The sun's quite sharp today. They walked on more quickly than necessary. Inspector Purbright observed this from the far side of the street. He had positioned himself by the notice board, reading nothing in particular. His presence was known, but not remarked upon. The advantage of being familiar was that people rarely wondered what one was doing. He noted the pause in conversation, the collective adjustment, the small acts of politeness applied where none had been requested. These were not signs of fear. They were signs of courtesy deployed inappropriately. At 11, Mrs. Bellows hosted tea. This, too, followed precedent. Her invitations were informal, her schedule inflexible. Attendance was considered optional only by those prepared to explain themselves later. Mr. Harcourt arrived precisely on time. Mrs. Bellows greeted him with warmth, then concern, then something like relief. You're looking well, she said, setting down her cup too firmly. Quite well. Thank you, he replied. They sat. Tea was poured. Biscuits were offered and declined in a pattern that suggested habit rather than appetite. Conversation turned, as it often did, to the state of the reading room. Someone remarked that the light there had been troublesome lately. It's been difficult to place oneself properly, Mrs. Bellows said, choosing her words with care. The glare moves. Mr. Harcourt nodded. He noticed that no one sat beside him. You know, said Mr. Pritchard, who disliked silence when it appeared uninvited, I saw you earlier. Or rather, he stopped. Everyone looked at him. Go on, Mrs. Bellows said, with encouragement that contained a warning. Well, Mr. Pritchard continued, flushing, I thought I did. But then you came in just now, and I realized I must have been mistaken. Mistaken how? Mr. Harcourt asked, gently. I thought you'd already gone past the green, Mr. Pritchard said. But you hadn't. Or perhaps you had. And, no, that doesn't make sense. Several people nodded. It made sense to them. They simply preferred not to articulate it. Mrs. Bellows cleared her throat. It's the light, she said. "We've all noticed it." "Yes," said another voice, too quickly. "The light." Inspector Purbright, listening from the doorway, made no note. Explanations offered in chorus were rarely explanatory. When the gathering broke up, it did so with exaggerated care. Chairs were pushed back quietly. Farewells were prolonged. Mr. Harcourt was thanked for attending, as though his presence required justification. Outside, Purbright fell into step beside him without announcement. "They are being kind," Mr. Harcourt said. "They are being careful," Purbright replied. "There is a difference." They walked a little further. "No one believes it's the light," Mr. Harcourt said. "No," Purbright agreed. "What do they believe?" Purbright did not answer at once. He was watching the ground. "They believe," he said eventually, "that something has altered without asking permission." Mr. Harcourt stopped. For a moment, the pavement seemed undecided. "And you?" he asked. Purbright met his gaze. "I believe," he said, "that people have begun adjusting before they understand what they are adjusting to." They resumed walking. Behind them, the village returned to its tea, its glances, and its careful avoidance of empty spaces. Inspector Purbright did not accompany Mr. Harcourt back toward the green. He turned instead toward the post office, where explanations tended to queue before anyone asked for them. The counter was occupied by Mrs. Dawkins, who spoke while counting stamps, thereby avoiding looking at anyone directly. She greeted Purbright with professional warmth and then, as if remembering a duty, added that she had seen Mr. Harcourt earlier, perhaps twice. She was not certain. The light, she said, was awkward near the window, and reflections could be misleading when one expected a thing to be present. Purbright agreed that expectations were influential. He asked what else had been noticed. Mrs. Dawkins hesitated, then said people were taking longer routes across the room. It saved time, she explained, by preventing collisions. She laughed, but only once. Outside, Purbright paused by the postbox. He watched letters disappear into it, each with a small sound of commitment. Reasonable explanations assembled themselves with similar confidence. The light, the weather, fatigue, a trick of attention. Each would satisfy, briefly, before requiring defense. At midday, he visited the school, not because children were reliable witnesses, but because adults behaved more honestly around them. The headmistress spoke at length about schedules and desks, then remarked that Mr. Harcourt had not cast a shadow across the assembly hall floor that morning. She said this as one might comment on a missing chalk, already replacing it in her mind. Purbright asked whether anyone had moved the lamps. No one had. Had the floor been polished? Not recently. Had Mr. Harcourt stood elsewhere? He had stood exactly where he always stood. By early afternoon, explanations had matured. They were exchanged with tea and sympathy, polished by repetition. Mr. Harcourt was tired. He had been unwell. He was distracted. Some suggested spectacles. Others proposed faith, quickly withdrawn. Purbright found Mr. Harcourt in the reading room, seated beneath a window that should have solved everything. Books lay open as alibis. The light behaved impeccably. "I am becoming an inconvenience," Mr. Harcourt said. "You are becoming a topic," Purbright replied. They reviewed the explanations together. Each was sensible. Each failed when placed beside the others. Sensible things, Purbright observed, often disagreed in company. "Someone suggested I was being dramatic," Mr. Harcourt said. They apologized immediately. Purbright smiled faintly. "Drama requires an audience that enjoys it." They fell silent. A man entered, paused, and chose a different chair. He nodded with gratitude, as though spared effort. "What is most troubling," Mr. Harcourt said, "is that no one is accusing me of anything. Accusations would clarify matters," Purbright said. "Courtesy prolongs them." As afternoon tilted, Purbright walked the village boundary. He noted where shadows behaved normally and where people stood to avoid noticing. He heard a story repeat itself with altered emphasis. Each teller improved it. At the green, two boys argued about where one of them had been standing earlier. They disagreed sharply until Purbright intervened. Neither could say why it mattered. By evening, Purbright concluded that the explanations were doing work. They were protecting routine. They were preventing panic. They were, collectively, wrong. He returned home and wrote nothing. Instead, he arranged his thoughts as one might arrange chairs for guests who had not yet arrived. The village settled. Lights came on. Shadows behaved. One absence remained, quietly persuasive. Purbright spent the later evening visiting houses without entering them. He stood at thresholds and accepted reports framed as apologies. People described moments when Mr. Harcourt had seemed present and absent at once, like a sentence interrupted by politeness. No one described fear. Several described relief. At the vicarage, a lamp had been repositioned 3 times. Each placement, the vicar explained, felt correct until it did not. Purbright asked whether the feeling arrived before or after the adjustment. After, the vicar said, as though that settled it. At the inn, a mirror behind the bar had been cleaned. The landlord said he preferred clarity. Purbright asked what had been unclear. The landlord said only that something had been untidy. Walking home, Purbright noticed how carefully people occupied space. They left margins. They stood aside. They spoke to air with practiced ease. The village, he thought, was rehearsing a kindness. He returned again to the green. The boys had gone. The grass held the day lightly. Purbright placed his foot where Mr. Harcourt usually stood and watched the shadow fall obediently. He stepped away and felt no triumph. Back at his desk, he listed the explanations he had heard and crossed out none of them. Instead, he drew a line beneath the list and wrote a single question, then closed the notebook without answering it. Somewhere, Mr. Harcourt was preparing for the evening. He would stand beneath a lamp. He would be greeted with care. He would thank people for their consideration. Purbright blew out the light and left the room dark. Absence, he reflected, was not the same as emptiness. It behaved differently. It asked to be managed. Outside, the village managed it. Nights settled with measured patience, and windows learned their shapes again. Somewhere a clock corrected itself. Purbright listened, allowing the village to continue its careful work, confident that understanding would arrive not by force, but by noticing who benefited most from the space left behind. Nothing changed immediately, yet everyone slept better, having agreed, without speaking, to keep the explanation provisional. Morning would test that agreement gently. The morning returned with an air of apology, as though it regretted the effort of the previous day. People greeted one another with renewed cheer, testing voices, testing certainty. The village had decided, collectively and without meeting, that the matter required softer handling. Mr. Harcourt noticed it immediately. Doors were held longer. Questions were asked and then revised mid-sentence. Remarks arrived padded with kindness, their meanings wrapped so carefully that they scarcely resembled themselves. "How are you managing?" became "Did you sleep well?" "You look different" became "That color suits you." "I thought you were elsewhere" became "I nearly missed you." Each substitution carried intention. Each avoided the shape of what was missing. Inspector Purbright observed from a distance that morning, allowing the village to demonstrate its method. He stood near the butcher's shop, where speech tended to be plain, and watched it soften. A woman asked for a joint of beef, then added that she hoped it was not too much trouble. The butcher assured her it was not, though he had never suggested otherwise. Mr. Harcourt approached, nodding to Purbright without pause. They did not speak. Speech, at that moment, would have clarified too much. Inside the shop, Mr. Harcourt was greeted warmly and served promptly. The butcher avoided looking down. When change was returned, it was placed into Mr. Harcourt's hand with ceremonial care, as though weight alone required acknowledgement. Outside again, Purbright fell into step beside him. "They are working very hard," Purbright said. "Yes," Mr. Harcourt replied. "I wish they would stop. They believe they are helping." "I know." They walked past the postbox. A man waiting there stepped back, then laughed, embarrassed by his own movement. He explained it away with a gesture that meant nothing. At the reading room, chairs had been rearranged. The gap near the window was gone, replaced by a smaller, more manageable space. Mr. Harcourt sat where he was directed. No one commented. Conversation drifted. Someone mentioned an upcoming fete. Another spoke of weather patterns with excessive detail. What they meant was that they were afraid of pauses. A woman began a sentence, stopped, and restarted with a different subject entirely. The first version hovered briefly, then disappeared. Purbright listened. He did not interrupt. He had learned that corrections, like accusations, altered behavior too quickly. Later, at the green, children played a game that required careful counting. They argued about turns, about boundaries, about who had been where. One child insisted another had crossed a line that no one else could see. The argument ended when an adult intervened and suggested a different game. "What did you mean?" the child demanded. "What you said," the adult replied firmly. The child accepted this with visible confusion. As afternoon wore on, meaning continued to retreat behind language. Invitations were extended without times. Apologies were offered without cause. People expressed concern without naming its object. Mr. Harcourt found himself thanked for things he had not done. He replied appropriately. Politeness had become a form of currency. Purbright noticed, too, what was not said. No one asked Mr. Harcourt where he had been earlier that morning. No one remarked on his position in relation to the light. No one mentioned shadows at all. Instead, they spoke of habits, of consistency, of how reassuring it was when things stayed as expected. At the inn, a man raised his glass and said, "Here's to familiar faces." He hesitated, then added, "and familiar places." The toast was accepted with enthusiasm. Purbright spoke to the landlord afterward. He asked whether business had changed. The landlord said only that people lingered less by the windows. "And what do you think that means?" Purbright asked. The landlord shrugged. "It means people prefer the center of things." Evening approached with a practiced calm. Lamps were lit earlier than usual. Curtains were drawn with purpose. The village prepared itself for rest by agreeing, silently, on what would not be discussed. Mr. Harcourt walked home alone. He passed neighbors who greeted him with relief, as though confirming his solidity through repetition. Each greeting landed slightly beside him. At his gate, he paused. He looked back along the path. Nothing followed. Purbright watched from across the way. He saw Mr. Harcourt straighten, adjust his coat, and step inside. He noted how the door closed gently, without emphasis. The inspector remained where he was, considering the day's lessons. People, he reflected, said what preserved order, not what conveyed truth. Meaning was negotiated, trimmed, and offered in portions small enough to be accepted. He wrote nothing that night. Instead, he recalled every softened phrase, every avoided word. He considered who benefited from their careful use. Somewhere between what people meant and what they said, a space had formed. It was being protected diligently. Understanding, Purbright knew, would come not from filling it, but from noticing who insisted it remain. For now, the village slept with language folded neatly away, confident that restraint was wisdom and that tomorrow would reward such care. Purbright allowed that belief to persist, knowing that patience, when shared, often revealed more than any question spoken aloud. He waited, attentive, as meaning continued its quiet work beneath the surface of ordinary speech. For now, morning brought with it a solution that no one had requested, which was often the village's way. By 9 o'clock a ladder leaned against the side of the reading room, and a man stood upon it with the calm authority of someone improving things. He was Mr. Ellison, retired, helpful, and fond of adjustments. He had decided that the lighting near the windows was inadequate and that a small alteration would restore balance. He said this to anyone who paused, and several did. Inspector Purbright arrived as the ladder was being steadied by 2 volunteers who had not been asked. He observed without comment. Improvements, he had found, often revealed more about their advocates than their aims. Mr. Harcourt approached from the far path. He stopped when he saw the ladder, then continued, expression composed. A greeting was exchanged. No one mentioned the work directly. The lamp was moved an inch, then another. Mr. Ellison stepped down, squinted, and climbed again. Each adjustment was accompanied by reassurance. It would help, he said. It would make things clearer. Purbright asked, lightly, what problem was being solved. Mr. Ellison hesitated. He laughed. He said it was better not to leave such matters vague. People appreciated clarity. Do they? Purbright asked. Mr. Ellison tightened a screw. When the ladder was removed, everyone waited. The light fell differently, though not decisively. Shadows behaved much as before. One absence remained politely unaddressed. Mrs. Bellows arrived and praised the effort. She said the room felt brighter already. Others agreed. Agreement spread quickly. Mr. Harcourt took his usual seat. The light reached him. It did not complete him. Someone suggested moving the table instead. Another offered curtains. The improvement had inspired ambition. Purbright watched Mr. Ellison carefully. The man was pleased, though faintly disappointed. Improvement, Purbright reflected, rarely achieved the satisfaction promised by its intention. Later that morning, a second improvement was attempted at the inn. A mirror was repositioned to better reflect the bar. The landlord explained that customers like to see themselves clearly. Purbright asked whether they had complained. The landlord said no, but that was hardly the point. Mr. Harcourt entered while the mirror was still being adjusted. He paused, then smiled at his reflection, or rather at the space where it failed to complete itself. No one remarked upon it. The mirror was declared satisfactory. At midday, Purbright visited the vicarage. A lamp had been moved closer to the desk. The vicar said it helped with reading. Purbright asked what had been difficult before. The vicar could not say. Everywhere, Purbright found the same pattern. Objects were shifted. Explanations followed. The village was tidying its discomfort. In the afternoon, Purbright spoke with Mr. Ellison privately. He asked how the idea had come to him. "I don't like unfinished things," Mr. Ellison said. "They draw the eye." "And now?" Purbright asked. Mr. Ellison frowned. "Now it seems worse, as though I've pointed it out." Purbright nodded. Improvements often sharpened attention. As evening approached, Mr. Harcourt walked the village once more. He passed the reading room, the inn, the green. Each place had been altered slightly, as though nudged toward reassurance. Each alteration failed him politely. At the green, children played again. Their game involved stepping into one another's places. They laughed when they collided. An adult watched closely. Purbright joined Mr. Harcourt near the low wall. "They mean well," Mr. Harcourt said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "That is the difficulty. Do you think it will stop?" Purbright considered the question. When the improvement no longer serves its purpose. And what purpose is that? To pretend the absence can be arranged away. They stood quietly. The light softened. Lamps began to glow. Across the green, Mr. Ellison watched them, troubled. He adjusted his coat, then moved a bench a fraction, then stopped, uncertain why. That night, Purbright noted each improvement in his mind and discarded it. None explained the behavior he had seen. All explained the need to act. The village slept among its adjusted objects, comforted by effort. Mr. Harcourt slept less well. He dreamed of rooms rearranging themselves. Purbright lay awake, thinking not of what had changed, but of who had initiated the changes and why. Improvement, he reflected, was often a form of defense. It resisted questions by offering activity instead. In the quiet before dawn, he understood that the unnecessary improvements had revealed something essential. They marked the places where people felt most exposed. They traced the outline of a problem no one wished to name. Understanding did not arrive with satisfaction. It arrived with restraint. Purbright waited, knowing that the next movement would not come from those who improved things, but from those who watched them being done. He reflected on the care with which people avoided saying why the changes unsettled them, and how improvement provided language where honesty felt abrupt. By adjusting objects, they adjusted themselves, rehearsing control. The absence remained, patient and unmoved, while activity gathered around it like furniture pushed against a draft. Purbright understood that such efforts could not persist indefinitely. Fatigue would arrive. Courtesy would fray. Someone would say the wrong thing in the right tone, and the village would listen. Until then, he would allow the improvements to continue, because they revealed alignment and anxiety in equal measure. He turned toward home as the sky lightened slightly, resolved to watch who resisted change next and who demanded it, for necessity often announced itself through needless work. Observation, he believed, would complete what rearrangement could not, when patience finally compelled clearer behavior from everyone involved. It began with a certainty expressed too confidently to be questioned. Mrs. Hargreaves said she had seen Mr. Harcourt walking toward the green at 4:15, and she said it as one might announce the time. She added that he looked well, which was unnecessary but deliberate, and that he had not acknowledged her wave because he was in a hurry. An hour later, Mr. Harcourt was observed entering the post office from the opposite direction, unhurried, hat in hand, apologizing for being late. Mrs. Dawkins accepted the apology and offered none of her own. When the discrepancy was mentioned, quietly, Mrs. Hargreaves insisted she could not be mistaken, while Mrs. Dawkins conceded that mistakes were possible, but habits less so. Inspector Purbright heard both accounts before dusk. He listened without interruption and noted that neither woman accused the other of error. Each spoke as though the explanation would reveal itself naturally if treated with patience. The phrase "seen twice" was not used immediately. It arrived later, softened by qualifiers. Someone said, "as though," and someone else said, "almost." By evening, the qualifiers had been dropped. Mr. Harcourt heard of it at the inn, where he was met with expressions of interest rather than alarm. A man asked whether he had enjoyed his walk. Another asked whether he had taken a second route. Both smiled with the same effortful cheer. "I was at home," Mr. Harcourt said truthfully. They accepted this without dispute, then continued as if he had answered differently. Purbright entered shortly after. He stood near the door and observed how conversation altered around Mr. Harcourt, tightening slightly, then expanding to accommodate the idea that two appearances could coexist without contradiction. "You see," said Mr. Pritchard, emboldened by his own explanation, "one never knows how the day will unfold." This was received with nods. Later, Purbright walked with Mr. Harcourt along the road Mrs. Hargreaves described. The light was even. The ground was ordinary. Purbright asked where Mr. Harcourt had been at the time in question. "Reading," Mr. Harcourt replied. "Alone?" Purbright asked whether anyone could confirm this. Mr. Harcourt said no, then added that he could confirm it himself. "That may not suffice," Purbright said mildly. "I know." They reached the green. Children were present, supervised loosely. Purbright asked one of them whether they had seen Mr. Harcourt earlier. The child nodded. When asked where, the child pointed in two directions, then looked confused. "That's not right," the child said. "No," Purbright agreed. As evening settled, the story gained texture. Mrs. Hargreaves recalled that Mr. Harcourt had seemed distracted. Mrs. Dawkins remembered him as attentive. Both details were added, not reconciled. Purbright visited Mrs. Hargreaves after supper. She welcomed him warmly and repeated her account with added precision. She described the set of Mr. Harcourt's shoulders, the angle of his hat. When Purbright asked about the shadow, she paused, then said she had not been looking at the ground. At the post office, Mrs. Dawkins was less certain now. She admitted that she might have expected Mr. Harcourt to appear and therefore noticed him when he did. Expectation, she said, could be persuasive. Purbright thanked them both and returned to the street. He found Mr. Harcourt standing beneath a lamp, looking up. "Do you feel divided?" Purbright asked. "No," Mr. Harcourt said. "I feel accounted for twice. That can be uncomfortable. It is oddly flattering." They walked on. By nightfall, the village had accepted the idea without enthusiasm. A man seen twice was peculiar, but not alarming. People adjusted. They allowed for overlap. They spoke carefully about time. Purbright considered the implications. Being seen twice suggested not duplication, but convenience. It served those who needed Mr. Harcourt to be elsewhere. At home, Purbright reviewed the day. He noted who benefited from Mr. Harcourt's supposed movement and who merely accommodated it. He noticed that Mrs. Hargreaves had been spared an explanation, while Mrs. Dawkins had been relieved of a weight. The next morning would bring clarification or further elaboration. Purbright suspected the latter. As he extinguished the lamp, he reflected that being seen twice was not an error of vision, but of agreement. People had consented to it because it smoothed their arrangements. The village, he thought, was beginning to place Mr. Harcourt where it needed him to be, regardless of where he stood. That, more than any absence, required attention. The theory arrived quietly, as most comforting things did. It was first suggested by Mrs. Bellows over tea, framed not as a conclusion, but as a relief. She said that Mr. Harcourt must have been overtired, and that tired people were often mistaken for being elsewhere, particularly when they were reliable and expected. The idea settled into the room with a murmur of agreement that felt almost grateful. By midday, it had acquired refinements. Someone said stress altered perception. Someone else added that routine could cause the eye to fill in gaps too eagerly. A man remarked that the mind was fond of patterns, even when they were inconvenient. Each contribution strengthened the theory without challenging it. Inspector Purbright listened as it took shape. He did not interrupt. Incorrect theories, he had learned, required space to grow comfortable. Only then did they reveal what they protected. Mr. Harcourt encountered the theory at the bakery. The baker's wife explained it gently, as one might explain weather. She assured him it was nothing to worry about, and that everyone had days when they were not entirely themselves. He thanked her and paid, noticing that she spoke to him with the tone usually reserved for convalescents. At the post office, Mrs. Dawkins nodded sympathetically and said she had read something similar once. She could not recall where. She said reading made one imagine things. By the afternoon, the theory had gained authority. People repeated it with confidence, no longer attributing it to Mrs. Bellows. It belonged to everyone now. The comfort lay not in its accuracy, but in its completeness. Purbright walked the village boundary again, listening to how the theory changed behavior. People stopped apologizing for confusion. They began explaining it away. A woman laughed and said she must have imagined seeing Mr. Harcourt earlier, and no one contradicted her. Mr. Harcourt found that invitations softened. He was urged to rest. Someone suggested he take a holiday. He replied politely and declined, sensing that absence of a different kind was being proposed. "Do you mind it?" Purbright asked him later as they stood near the green. "I mind the kindness," Mr. Harcourt said. "It assumes something." "Yes," Purbright said, "that you are the cause." They watched a group of villagers arrange chairs for an evening meeting. One chair was placed slightly apart, then moved closer after a glance in Mr. Harcourt's direction. The theory simplified matters. It allowed people to forget the improvements, the double sightings, the careful language. It suggested that nothing fundamental had altered, only perception. Purbright noted who embraced it most readily. They were people whose routines benefited from stability. That evening, at the inn, the theory was toasted without being named. A man raised his glass and said it was good when things had explanations. Another added that mystery was overrated. Mr. Harcourt smiled and drank. Purbright observed that the theory required cooperation. It needed people to remember selectively, to reinterpret yesterday in light of today. It asked them to accept small contradictions for the sake of calm. Later, Purbright spoke privately with Mrs. Bellows. He asked whether she truly believed Mr. Harcourt had been overtired. "Oh no," she said promptly. "But it's better, don't you think?" "Better for whom?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Bellows considered. "For us." Purbright left her with the thought. Night brought quiet agreement. Windows glowed. Conversations shortened. The village rested on its explanation like a cushion, grateful for the support. Mr. Harcourt slept fitfully, dreaming of rooms where people spoke around him. Purbright lay awake, considering the theory's elegance. It explained nothing and excused everything. It required no action and discouraged inquiry. It was, he thought, a perfect shelter. The next morning would test it. Incorrect theories always invited contradiction, however gently. Purbright suspected that someone would soon find the comfort insufficient. As dawn approached, he resolved not to disturb the theory prematurely. Comfort, once offered, revealed its cost when withdrawn. He would wait to see who resisted the theory, who repeated it too often, and who relied upon it most heavily. Outside, the village prepared for another day, reassured by its shared belief. The incorrect theory held, for now, smoothing over the absence with practiced ease. Purbright knew it would not endure, but he allowed it its moment. It had earned that much by showing him how badly it was needed, and by whom. The incorrect theory endured until it was asked to perform work it had not agreed to do. That request arrived in the form of a social obligation, minor in scale but absolute in expectation. Mrs. Calder's Thursday luncheon. Mrs. Calder did not forgive absence easily. Her invitations were understood to be acknowledgments of standing, and declining them suggested either illness or dissent. Mr. Harcourt attended as he always had, arriving precisely on time, coat brushed, expression attentive. What altered was not his behavior, but the behavior arranged around him. Mrs. Calder greeted him warmly, then introduced him twice to the same guest. She laughed when this was pointed out and blamed her memory. The guest laughed too, though later admitted she had felt briefly unsettled, as though something had failed to align. At table, places had been set with care. Mr. Harcourt's seat was correct, yet conversation flowed around it oddly, like water meeting a smooth stone. Questions were directed toward him and then diverted mid-course. Compliments were offered, then generalized. Purbright, present by invitation and tolerated curiosity, observed the strain. Social rituals depended on mutual recognition, and recognition now required adjustment. Every courtesy carried calculation. Mrs. Calder asked Mr. Harcourt whether he had enjoyed his walk the previous afternoon. He replied that he had not taken one. She smiled and said she must be mistaken, then apologized for the question as though it had been indiscreet. "No apology necessary," Mr. Harcourt said. It was, unfortunately, the wrong response. The apology had been intended to complete the exchange, not prolong it. Mrs. Calder hesitated, then laughed again, a fraction too loudly. As luncheon continued, small failures accumulated. Mr. Harcourt reached for the salt, and another hand withdrew quickly, embarrassed. A chair scraped as someone adjusted position unnecessarily. A story was told in which Mr. Harcourt featured, then revised so that he did not. Purbright noted who watched these moments most closely. Mrs. Calder herself was vigilant, smoothing edges, redirecting attention. She was working harder than usual. After dessert, coffee was served in the drawing room. Mr. Harcourt stood by the window. No one stood beside him. Mrs. Calder approached Purbright later and asked whether he thought Mr. Harcourt seemed well. Purbright replied that he seemed consistent. She frowned, dissatisfied. "Consistency can be tiring," she said. "Yes," Purbright agreed, "when others must supply it." The luncheon ended with elaborate politeness. Mr. Harcourt was thanked for coming, for his company, for his understanding. He replied with equal care. When he left, conversation resumed more freely, though several guests glanced toward the door as if expecting him to reappear. Outside, Purbright joined him. "They tried," Mr. Harcourt said. "They did," Purbright replied, "and failed. It was no one's fault." That, Purbright said, is rarely true. They walked a little way in silence. The failure of the luncheon traveled quickly, not as criticism, but as concern. Mrs. Calder was said to be exhausted. Someone remarked that such gatherings were becoming difficult. Another suggested smaller groups. The theory of overtiredness was adjusted accordingly. It now included social strain. People spoke of limits, of expectations, of the need for rest. Mr. Harcourt was encouraged to excuse himself from future obligations. This, too, was kindness and improper. Purbright noticed the resistance. Mr. Harcourt declined no invitations. He continued as before. His presence forced the village to confront what it preferred to manage quietly. That evening, a committee meeting took place. Mr. Harcourt attended. He was acknowledged, deferred to, then overlooked. His vote was counted twice, then corrected. At one point, a motion was passed that Mr. Harcourt had opposed. The correction arrived too late to alter it. No one apologized. The error was treated as unfortunate rather than improper. Purbright watched faces carefully. He saw relief when the meeting ended. Afterward, he spoke with a man who had sat beside Mr. Harcourt. "It's awkward," the man said. "One doesn't know where one stands." Purbright asked where he thought Mr. Harcourt stood. The man gestured vaguely. "About." Walking home, Purbright considered the pattern. Social obligations relied on shared assumptions. When those assumptions faltered, obligation became effort. Effort bred resentment, however mild. The incorrect theory had protected people from fear. It could not protect them from inconvenience. That night, Mr. Harcourt stood in his sitting room, lamp lit, reflection incomplete. He felt tired, but not in the way people suggested. Purbright, at his desk, wrote a single line and underlined it twice. Social failure, he thought, revealed truth more reliably than accusation. People revealed themselves not when they were alarmed, but when they were required to behave as usual and found they could not. The village slept uneasily, not because something was wrong, but because something was being asked of it that it could not politely refuse. Social obligations, improperly met, had begun to erode the comfort of the incorrect theory. Morning would require a different response. The silence did not begin where anyone could point to it. It arrived indirectly, like news overheard, and carried onward without attribution. By mid-morning, the village was quieter, though nothing obvious had been removed. It started at the bakery. The bell rang, bread was purchased, pleasantries exchanged. What did not occur was the usual comment about the weather, which everyone noticed only afterward. The baker's wife paused, surprised by the ease of the transaction, then smiled as though grateful for the restraint. The silence moved next to the post office, where Mrs. Dawkins processed letters without commentary. She noticed the absence of remark about the queue length and approved of it. Efficiency, she thought, was underrated. By the time Inspector Purbright passed through the green, the silence had acquired confidence. People nodded rather than spoke. Children played without argument. The air felt unusually well managed. Mr. Harcourt sensed it immediately. Where words had once padded interactions, now there were gaps. Greetings were brief. Explanations were withheld. People behaved as though speaking too much might invite complication. He entered the reading room and found it occupied but subdued. Chairs were filled. Pages turned. No one addressed him directly, though several acknowledged his presence with small gestures that asked for nothing in return. Purbright observed from the doorway. Silence, he reflected, was rarely neutral. It tended to serve someone. At midday, Mrs. Bellows hosted tea again. Attendance was thinner. Those who came spoke carefully, as if aware that each sentence might be their last contribution for some time. Conversation stalled after a remark about the biscuits. No one rescued it. Instead, cups were lifted. Sips were taken. The silence settled, companionable but alert. Mrs. Bellows watched faces closely. She noticed that silence relieved effort. It required no adjustment, no careful phrasing. It did not need to be improved. Later, she admitted to Purbright that she preferred it. "One can think," she said. Purbright asked what she had been thinking. She hesitated, then said nothing. The silence continued its progress. At the inn, it replaced speculation. The landlord wiped the counter longer than necessary. Patrons drank without comment. When Mr. Harcourt entered, several looked up, then down again, content to allow his presence without interpretation. A man raised his glass halfway, then lowered it without explanation. No one remarked upon it. The silence absorbed the gesture and moved on. Purbright sat with Mr. Harcourt near the fire. "They have stopped explaining," Mr. Harcourt said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "They have begun waiting." "For what?" Purbright did not answer. He was listening to the room. The silence did not eliminate tension. It redistributed it. Where speech had failed, glances now did the work. People watched one another more closely. Absence of comment required interpretation. By afternoon, the silence had acquired direction. It flowed toward those who resisted it. A woman attempted to revive the overtiredness theory at the post office and found herself unanswered. Her words fell and remained where they landed. She flushed and withdrew. Another man attempted humor at the green and was met with polite nods that closed the matter firmly. The silence was not hostile. It was selective. Purbright noticed that it favored certain arrangements. It allowed Mr. Harcourt to exist without being assigned location or cause. It spared people from admitting their earlier efforts had failed. It also concealed something. As evening approached, Purbright walked with Mr. Harcourt along the village edge. They passed hedges trimmed recently, paths swept clean. Care had been applied everywhere. "No one is asking where I was," Mr. Harcourt said. "No," Purbright replied. "They are allowing you to be nowhere in particular. That seems worse." "It is easier," Purbright said. "Easier often replaces better." At dusk, the silence reached the vicarage. Evening prayers were shorter. The vicar omitted a line, then did not return to it. Congregants noticed, then decided it was intentional. Purbright watched the congregation disperse. No one lingered. Night settled with remarkable smoothness. Lamps were lit. Curtains drawn. The village prepared for rest without discussion. Purbright returned home and sat without lighting the lamp. He allowed the silence to arrive there too. It was heavier indoors, more deliberate. He considered its purpose. Silence removed the need to reconcile contradictions. It allowed the village to hold incompatible ideas without resolving them. It traveled because it worked. Yet silence also carried things along with it. Unasked questions moved beneath its surface, accumulating weight. Elsewhere, Mr. Harcourt sat alone. He found the silence oppressive, not because it accused him, but because it relieved everyone else of responsibility. He was no longer required to respond, but neither was he invited. Purbright understood then that the silence was temporary. It would continue until someone needed speech more than comfort. When that happened, the silence would break unevenly, revealing where pressure had been stored. He slept lightly, listening for interruption. By morning, the silence would have reached its furthest point. It would have touched every routine, every courtesy. It would have become noticeable by its own success. When it broke, it would travel just as quickly in the opposite direction, carrying with it whatever truth people had been protecting by not speaking. Purbright was prepared to follow it when it moved. The silence broke first where it had been most carefully maintained. Mrs. Bellows spoke at the bakery, not loudly, and not to anyone in particular. She said that it was becoming difficult to know when politeness ended and evasion began. The baker's wife did not reply immediately, which was itself a reply, and the remark traveled no further in words, though its effect moved quickly. By mid-morning, people had resumed speaking, but differently. They did not explain, and they did not accuse. They stated things plainly, then allowed them to stand without defense. Mr. Harcourt noticed the change at once. A neighbor greeted him and said, "I don't know where I saw you yesterday, but I did." There was no apology attached. Another said, "It unsettles me, and I don't know why." They waited, not for reassurance, but acknowledgement. Inspector Purbright listened. This was not agreement. It was something less tidy and more useful. At the post office, Mrs. Dawkins admitted that she had rearranged her afternoon because she believed Mr. Harcourt would be elsewhere. She said this neutrally, as though discussing the weather. Purbright asked whether this had inconvenienced her. She replied that it had not, but that she disliked being mistaken without knowing how. In the reading room, chairs were returned to their former places. No one remarked upon the change. Mr. Harcourt took his usual seat. Light reached him. Absence remained. A man approached Purbright quietly and said that he had found the silence reassuring until it became lonely. He asked whether that was unreasonable. Purbright said it was understandable. They walked together briefly, then parted without conclusion. Throughout the day, similar exchanges occurred. People described effects without naming causes. They spoke of adjustments they had made, assumptions they had relied upon, comforts they were reluctant to surrender. No one demanded resolution. Mr. Harcourt felt exposed in a new way. He was no longer the subject of careful avoidance, but of frank uncertainty. It was less comfortable, but more honest. At the green, children played their counting game again. This time, when disagreement arose, they stopped and recalculated. It took longer. They accepted the delay. Purbright observed this with interest. By afternoon, the village had arrived at an understanding without agreement. They accepted that something had altered. They did not agree on what. They agreed only that pretending otherwise required too much effort. Mrs. Calder spoke to Purbright privately. She said she had been wrong to suggest Mr. Harcourt rest rather than attend. She said it had been easier to remove him than to reconsider her arrangements. Purbright thanked her for saying so. She did not ask for absolution. Later, Mr. Ellison approached Purbright and admitted that his improvements had been attempts to regain control. He said he disliked being surprised by ordinary things. Purbright said that was common. Mr. Ellison seemed relieved. As evening approached, Purbright walked with Mr. Harcourt once more. "They don't agree," Mr. Harcourt said. "No," Purbright replied. "But they understand they disagree. That seems insufficient. It is sufficient to proceed." They stopped beneath a lamp. Purbright watched the light fall as it should. He did not expect completion. "What happens now?" Mr. Harcourt asked. "Now," Purbright said, "we notice who still insists on certainty." They parted without ceremony. That night, conversation at the inn was uneven but genuine. People contradicted one another openly, then laughed, not to soften the contradiction but to acknowledge it. The incorrect theory was not mentioned. Silence did not return. Purbright sat alone, listening. He noted the absence of resolution and found it encouraging. Villages, he knew, were poor at conclusions but adept at accommodation. Mr. Harcourt walked home feeling lighter, though unchanged. He had not recovered anything, but he had regained presence. People looked at him directly now, even when uncertain. Purbright returned to his desk and wrote again, this time more than a line. He did not record conclusions. He recorded behaviors, who spoke first, who resisted, who adjusted reluctantly. Understanding, he reflected, did not require agreement. It required willingness to proceed without comfort. The village settled into evening with that willingness imperfect but sincere. Lamps glowed. Shadows behaved. One absence persisted, but it was no longer managed in silence or explained away. Purbright knew the matter was nearing its end, not because clarity had been achieved, but because the village had accepted the cost of honesty. The final movement would come not from revelation, but from recognition. He extinguished the lamp and allowed the room to darken naturally, confident that what remained would soon make itself known, not through force or confession, but through the small, unavoidable choices people made when certainty was no longer available to them. It was Mr. Ellison who noticed it first, though he did not say so immediately. He noticed it in the careful way of a man who had learned that observation was not always welcome. Standing near the green, watching nothing in particular, he realized that he was being watched in return. Not directly, not rudely, but with a steadiness that suggested accounting. He shifted his weight. The attention did not move. Across the green, Inspector Purbright stood with his hands loosely folded, apparently absorbed in the notice board. His gaze did not fix on Mr. Ellison, but neither did it wander. It allowed Mr. Ellison to exist within it without permission. Mr. Ellison adjusted his coat and moved away, unsettled. That afternoon, similar discomfort appeared elsewhere. Mrs. Dawkins felt it at the post office when she realized Purbright was listening without prompting. He asked no questions. He merely waited, attentive, as she explained a change she had made to her routine without knowing why. At the bakery, the baker's wife found herself recounting the same moment twice, then stopping when she noticed Purbright's expression remain unchanged. He neither encouraged nor corrected her. The absence of response required completion. By early evening, the sensation had traveled. People were aware of being observed not suspiciously, but accurately. It was not accusation that unsettled them, but recognition. Mr. Harcourt felt it most keenly. For days, attention had slipped around him. Now it settled, not heavily, but firmly. People looked at him when they spoke, and did not look away when they finished. At the end, a man said to Purbright, "I suppose we have all been adjusting things." He waited. Purbright nodded once. The man continued, surprised to hear himself. He admitted that he had preferred Mr. Harcourt to be elsewhere because it simplified an arrangement he did not care to explain. Saying so did not relieve him. It clarified him. Purbright listened and asked only whether the arrangement still existed. It did. Purbright thanked him and wrote nothing. Later, Mrs. Calder approached Purbright with visible resolve. She said she had avoided noticing how often she redirected conversation away from Mr. Harcourt. She said it had felt efficient at the time. Purbright asked when it had stopped feeling so. She replied, "When I realized you had noticed." That was the small matter, not the shadow, not the absence, but the moment people realized their adjustments had been seen. Purbright spent the evening walking the village slowly, not hiding his presence. He greeted people politely. He stood where he could be seen. He allowed them to become aware of him, noticing patterns rather than events. Mr. Harcourt accompanied him partway. "You have not accused anyone," Mr. Harcourt said. "No," Purbright replied. "That would end the matter too quickly." "What will end it?" Purbright paused. "Being observed has a way of altering behavior without argument." They stopped beneath a lamp. The light behaved. The absence remained, but it no longer occupied the center. At the green, children had gathered again. They counted aloud, carefully, correcting one another without quarrel. An adult watched, smiled, and said nothing. Purbright spoke briefly with Mr. Ellison. He asked whether the improvements had ceased. Mr. Ellison said they had. He said he no longer felt the need. Purbright asked why. Mr. Ellison said it was difficult to rearrange things when one felt visible. Night settled. The village did not retreat into silence. It spoke plainly and briefly. People admitted small acts of convenience, small evasions. No one demanded explanation for the absence. They spoke instead of how they had responded to it. Mr. Harcourt stood in his sitting room and felt, for the first time, neither accommodated nor avoided. He was simply present. It did not restore what was missing, but it returned proportion. Purbright returned home and reviewed the day without writing. He understood now that the village had not taken anything from Mr. Harcourt. It had borrowed space around him, quietly, for its own purposes. The shadow had not been lost so much as ignored, because ignoring it was useful. By observing the use, Purbright had ended it. The next morning, the village woke without expectation. People resumed routines without adjustment. Mr. Harcourt walked to the bakery and was greeted once. The baker's wife looked at him, then at the floor, then back again, satisfied. Purbright watched from across the street. He saw no restoration. He saw resolution. Later that day, without comment, a shadow appeared beside Mr. Harcourt where the light allowed it. No one remarked upon it. No one gathered. It was not announced. Purbright noted the moment only because it went unnoticed. He did not explain it. He did not need to. The matter had never required explanation, only attention. That evening, as lamps were lit and curtains drawn, the village settled easily. Nothing had been recovered. Nothing had been taken. Understanding had arrived through being observed, and with it, the freedom to behave ordinarily again. Purbright extinguished his lamp and allowed the room to darken. Outside, shadows fell where they should, unremarkable at last. The end.